Well, Poppy, this is a big question for many people. No country stands still. But the question is the country evolving in line with the values of those who fought to defend its freedom, or have we been knocked off course?
I would say that it's probably more convincing to say that we have been knocked off course. I thought the wording there was quite interesting, the idea of moving on from history. Now, I know about D-Day, I'm a history buff and I'm a Conservative, so I'm not particularly representative of young people. So what I did is I called up my sister and I was like, Georgia, when you were at school, she was only 2 years younger than me, it wasn't that long ago, but did you learn about D-Day, didn't you? I was like, oh, maybe. We may have done it at some point in year 6 when she was about 10 or 11. And I said, so what did you do during your GCSE history? She said, well, we did a course on our migration story and we did a course on medicine through time. So these are both interesting areas of history.
I have to say, I did medicine through time.
I think I did it too. It wasn't much medicine through time.
Well, it was Jon Snow and the Broad Street Pump. That's the origin of germ theory.
Exactly. But, history is always political. History is never taught in an entirely neutral way. And so I think you can glean a lot from what this country prioritises in its history curriculum for young people. Now, there is a lot of talk at the moment about teaching more about Britain's history, but not about World War II. We're talking about maybe Britain's crimes, Britain's place in empire, what we did to the colonies around the world. And when we do talk about Britain's place in the modern world, it is of an upholder of human rights. And we've retroactively gone back to World War II, which was ultimately, these were all nationalistic wars. People were fighting for the existential health of their own country. They were not necessarily fighting and dying to uphold a concept of human rights. That's not really what happened. It's the story that we often hear now, but that's because, again, history is reflecting the politics that we have today. So am I surprised that half of young people know about D-Day? I'm surprised it's so high, to be honest with you. I just don't think that's the priority of people anymore, to talk about that old world. There's really been a distinction where we've broken off from that, I believe.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I would be very happy to bet just about all the money that I have that more Brits could name Martin Luther King than William Wilberforce.
Oh, absolutely.
I think all people at school learn about the American civil rights struggle, but not about the anti-slavery campaign that was fought in this country, perhaps because it was advanced by Christians and by white people.
Yes. Well, there is a post-war order that I think, a lot of Europeans and Americans have, repositioned that idea of the world. Now, this is knocked by things like post-colonial movements, what we now might call something like woke, which has a conception of the idea of the West as a baddie. And we can only seem to see the world in in black and white, good and bad. And even now, I think sometimes from the right, people will talk about World War II and they'll hold it up as, well, look, here we were being good. We were doing something for good. And of course we were fighting a good war.
Perhaps the most obvious example of a just war.
But is that not still such a narrow way to think of one's country? You are limiting yourself to only be able to look at what we've done, whether or not it was a good thing or whether or not it was a bad thing. I'm sorry, but our history is so much more fascinating, complex and rich than that. And to boil ourselves down to whether or not we were the heroes or villains of history really sells the country short.
Really interesting stuff. Let's throw this to the panel. Nigel, what do you make of it all?
Well, when it comes down to young people, they see the whole thing as history. My generation grew up against the backdrop of what happened. My parents both served during the Second World War. My father in the Navy, my mother was a spy. So they'd actually had that. I grew up with that kind of background. For children, this is a long time ago. So the answer is, I think Pop is right there. The answer, therefore, is that we should be teaching it much more in schools. And when it comes down to did they fight for the Britain that it turned out to be? Well, yes, they did. We're a democracy. We would have been a dictatorship if they'd failed.
I suppose that is a pretty clear-cut answer. Lord Goodman, do you agree?
I think when people join the army, as my uncle did, presumably at some point in the 30s, I don't think they joined to fight for the future. I think they joined because maybe someone in their family served in the army, which is the case for my uncle, or their friends have joined up, or they want, in some quite values-free way, really, to serve this simple thing of their country. So I'm not sure they're looking forward 60 or 80 years to see what happened any more than people in 1940 were looking back to 1860 and thinking about, say, the Crimean War. What may be hedging around this discussion, of course, is the change that's happened to the country since 1940 in terms of mass immigration, multiculturalism, cultural change. But even then, there are stories you can tell which aren't stories about how bad we've always been. So something like 87,000 troops from the old Imperial India died in the war. You know, they died fighting for the country. Hundreds and thousands of them served, and maybe
served for king and empire.
Served for king and empire, and maybe for all sorts of different reasons, mark you. But maybe we could make more of that rather than beating ourselves up all the time.
Nigel, do you think that's a fair point?
Yeah, it is a fair point. I mean, obviously, when we did have colonies, that those people from the colonies fought on our behalf. And especially when you mention India, they were being threatened at the time by the Japanese, so any troops who came over here were being taken away from their front. But what we need to do is see the whole thing in the round.
And yet a consequence of this war, perhaps an unintended consequence, was the dismemberment, the dismantlement of the British Empire.
Yeah, we ran out of money. I mean, the whole thing is we fought the war, and by the end of that, we didn't have much clout left. So it was understandable that the British Empire would then...
We signed up to the Atlantic Declaration. Poppy, a last word to you.
I mean, I suppose the question that we should really be asking now is how many people would fight in similar circumstances? I saw a poll came out earlier, and I think the wording was a little bit leading, but it was essentially on the lines of, would you want to fight for your country? And I think the numbers were about 15%. Now, I think it might be different if it is an extensional battle, and if you're not fighting, you are becoming a dictatorship. But that is probably a question we need to ask ourselves. How many people now would fight and die for our country?
Or is that a luxury? It tends to be the closer you are to existential risk, the higher the percentage. If you look at Lithuania and Latvia, it's rather a lot higher than France or the United Kingdom. But to Poppy and indeed to my panel, thank you so much for talking through all of that. Now,